It is a hot July afternoon, 1945. A faint breeze stirs the dust at the entrance of a small makeshift camp, newly liberated from the horrors of war. The sound of American trucks rumbling through the camp breaks the silence, and a group of German women, thin and gaunt from years of starvation, watch in cautious curiosity. Their eyes, once hardened by years of brutality, flicker with a mixture of disbelief and cautious hope. Then the soldiers unload their cargo, ice cream. The women, stunned, gather in a loose circle as American soldiers, grinning and offering what seemed like a simple, foreign treat, begin serving them with gentle hands. The soldiers' faces, tired yet relieved, mirror their own shock. For the first time in years, the women taste something sweet, something cold, something that isn't associated with pain or fear, a small but profound moment of kindness in the middle of a shattered world. By the summer of 1945, the world had already begun to feel the immense weight of the war's end. In Europe, the Allied forces were advancing rapidly, pushing the Nazi regime into a corner from which there was no escape. The collapse of Hitler's empire seemed imminent. The Soviet Union was carving its way westward through Eastern Europe, while American and British forces were steadily closing in from the west. Cities lay in ruins. The suffering of civilians and soldiers alike was palpable in every town and village across the continent. Among the most affected by the war's brutalities were the women imprisoned in Nazi concentration camps. For years they had lived under unimaginable conditions, forced labor, starvation, and constant fear. Their days were measured by exhaustion, their nights by the terror of brutality at the hands of their captors. By 1945, many of the camps had been abandoned by the Germans, who retreated to the east in a desperate attempt to escape the advancing Allies. But even in their absence, the prisoners remained trapped in their suffering, barely clinging to life. Then, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler committed suicide in his bunker beneath the streets of Berlin. The death of the Führer was a blow to the Nazi regime, but the war raged on for several more weeks. It was only a matter of time before the Allies would liberate the millions of people trapped within the camps. In early May 1945, the American forces began their liberation of Nazi concentration camps across Germany. As they entered these places of torment, their mission was not only to dismantle the infrastructure of Nazi tyranny, but also to provide immediate aid to the survivors. The soldiers, many of whom had seen firsthand the brutality of the war, were tasked with delivering food, medical supplies, and the most basic comforts like fresh water and, for some, even a treat as simple as ice cream. The arrival of American soldiers in the concentration camps was an emotional and complex experience for both the liberators and the liberated. For the soldiers, the sight of emaciated prisoners, some barely alive, was deeply unsettling. Many had read about the atrocities, but nothing could prepare them for the sheer scale of human suffering they witnessed. Yet they were not just soldiers, they were also men who had experienced the horrors of war. The liberators understood the trauma of survival in a broken world. Among their first orders of business was providing aid, both physical and psychological. But the task was far from simple. While medical teams worked tirelessly to treat the sick and injured, the soldiers began offering basic comforts, rations, blankets, and a semblance of normalcy in the midst of chaos. It was in this context that one of the most unexpected acts of kindness would occur: the serving of ice cream. At first, it seemed like an absurd idea. How could something so mundane as a frozen dessert matter in such a setting? But it was precisely this small indulgence, this gesture of humanity, that had a profound effect on the women in the camps. Ice cream, in its simplicity, was not just a treat. It symbolized the return of comfort, the restoration of dignity, and perhaps most importantly, the return of life to women who had spent years in a state of constant fear and deprivation. The logistics behind such an act were not simple. Ice cream, a perishable commodity, would require the Americans to have set up makeshift refrigeration in the middle of a war zone. The soldiers, with their limited resources, worked swiftly to make it happen, seeing it as more than just a momentary indulgence. It was an opportunity to offer the survivors something they hadn't tasted in years: sweetness. It was not simply food, it was a message. A reminder that life in all its sweetness could still be possible after the horrors of war. For the women imprisoned in the Nazi camps, the delivery of ice cream was an event that defied belief. After years of enduring the unspeakable, they were met not with brutality but with kindness. Their reaction was a mixture of disbelief, joy, and confusion. In their malnourished state, their bodies trembled with the effort of taking in the cold, creamy treat. Many of these women had not experienced the simplest comforts for years. Their minds, conditioned by daily trauma, struggled to comprehend the gesture. What could it possibly mean after all they had endured? But as the ice cream melted on their tongues, they felt something unfamiliar: hope. A part of their humanity, so long buried under the weight of suffering, began to reawaken. For these women, the gesture was not just a treat. It was a mark of freedom. It was a promise that they were no longer forgotten, that they had not been abandoned in their darkest hour. It was a gift of dignity, an acknowledgement that they were still deserving of care, love, and respect. Ice cream, of all things, became a symbol of their survival, a reminder that their humanity had been preserved even in the face of unimaginable cruelty. The act of serving ice cream to the prisoners may seem trivial, but it was a tactical choice laden with significance. The American forces, fresh from the victory over Nazi Germany, were keenly aware of the importance of providing immediate aid to those they liberated. The soldiers' mission was not just about defeating the enemy, it was about restoring a sense of humanity to a world that had been torn apart. In a practical sense, the ice cream also represented a step in rebuilding morale, both for the survivors and for the soldiers who had witnessed the horrors of war. Logistically, the act of serving ice cream to survivors was no small feat. The Allies had to secure refrigeration on the battlefield, a rare commodity at the time, especially in areas still reeling from war. It was not simply a matter of bringing food to the camps, it required planning, coordination, and resourcefulness. In this context, the ice cream served as a tactical victory in the war against despair. It was an opportunity to show that even after the most devastating of human experiences, joy could still be found. The logistics behind such a simple gesture as serving ice cream in a war-torn Europe reveal much about the resourcefulness and leadership of the American forces during this period. In a time when resources were scarce and the immediate needs of the soldiers were prioritized, providing a luxury like ice cream required ingenuity and determination. Military leaders, though primarily focused on military objectives, also recognized the need for psychological and emotional healing, particularly in the aftermath of the brutal war. They understood that this was not just a mission of military conquest, but of rehabilitation and restoration of human dignity. The ability to deliver ice cream to liberated prisoners was possible through the efforts of American supply chains, which were still functioning at full capacity despite the ongoing war. Field kitchens, mobile refrigeration units, and supply trucks filled with non-perishable goods became critical in providing not just food, but also comfort to those liberated. It wasn't only about feeding people, it was about nourishing them in a way that could help restore their spirits. The leadership of these military units knew that for many survivors, the war was far from over. The psychological toll of their years of suffering was immense. Ice cream, simple as it seemed, became a small yet significant part of their recovery. The moral impact of serving ice cream to these women was profound. In a world where survival was often linked to cruelty, to receive such a gesture was to encounter a different kind of warfare, one rooted in compassion. For the soldiers, this moment symbolized more than just an act of charity. It was a recognition that despite the brutality they had witnessed, there was still room for humanity in this world. The American forces, by providing such a seemingly trivial but incredibly meaningful gesture, were making a statement that even in the aftermath of total war, small acts of kindness could have the power to heal wounds that ran deeper than the physical. For the liberated women, the ice cream was a reminder that not all people were capable of such inhumanity. It was a reassurance that, in a world torn apart by hatred and violence, goodness still existed. The moral weight of the gesture was not lost on the survivors. They understood that they had been freed from far more than just physical imprisonment. They had been freed from a system that had tried to strip them of their basic humanity. In the cool, creamy sweetness of the ice cream, they tasted a glimmer of hope for the future, a future where they were more than just victims. The moment the ice cream was served marked a turning point, not just in the lives of the liberated women, but in the larger context of the Allied mission. It was July 4th, 1945, an ironic yet fitting date. Independence Day in the United States was a celebration of freedom. And on that day, the women in the camp were experiencing a freedom they had longed for but never thought possible. As the cold, creamy treat passed from soldier to prisoner, a wave of disbelief swept over the women. They had been stripped of everything: family, dignity, hope. But now, here they were, receiving something so simple, so pure, yet so powerful in its symbolism. For the American soldiers, it was a surreal experience. Many of them had fought through the brutal European campaigns, seeing unspeakable violence and suffering along the way. They had witnessed the carnage of D-Day, the liberation of cities, and the steady march to Berlin. But nothing prepared them for the faces of the women who had survived the camps. Their eyes, hollowed by hunger and fear, began to soften as they tasted the ice cream. For some of the soldiers, this small act was their first real connection to the human cost of the war. It was a profound moment, one that would stay with them long after the war ended. They were not just soldiers anymore. They were human beings offering something far more valuable than any military victory: hope. The soldiers, many of whom had grown accustomed to the harsh realities of combat, found themselves in a moment of vulnerability as they interacted with the women. There were no orders being barked, no weapons drawn. This was a moment of shared humanity. Both sides were witnessing an emotional and symbolic act that transcended the brutality of the war. The ice cream wasn't just a food. It was the manifestation of everything that the soldiers had been fighting for: freedom, dignity, and life. As the prisoners licked the ice cream, they seemed to grasp the full weight of the moment, albeit in their fragile, exhausted states. Some women wept quietly, unable to believe that they were free, that something as simple as ice cream could make them feel human again. They had survived years of unimaginable horrors: forced labor, starvation, and brutal punishments. Yet in this fleeting moment, the trauma was momentarily soothed by the touch of something cold and sweet. It was a temporary escape from their grim reality, a momentary pause in their lives that allowed them to feel alive again. For the American soldiers, there was an emotional transformation as well. The act of serving ice cream, something that seemed trivial in the face of war, became a symbolic gesture that redefined their mission. It was no longer just about defeating an enemy or securing land. It was about restoring the humanity of those they had liberated. The ice cream was a small victory in a war that had taken so much. As they watched the women savor the treat, the soldiers understood the power of kindness. How something as small as a bowl of ice cream could offer a sense of restoration to a world in ruins. This was a reminder that even in the darkest chapters of history, acts of compassion could still shine through. The impact of this moment rippled far beyond the immediate camp. For the women, it represented not just freedom, but the reassertion of their value as human beings. It was a reminder that despite the systematic effort to dehumanize them, they were still worthy of kindness, of sweetness, of life. For the soldiers, it marked the end of their military mission, but also the beginning of their recognition that the true cost of the war was measured not in battles won or lost, but in lives saved, restored, and given a chance to rebuild. The liberation of the concentration camps, including the one where ice cream was served, marked the beginning of the end for Nazi tyranny, but it also marked the beginning of a long and difficult recovery for those who had been imprisoned. The immediate aftermath saw the survivors facing the daunting challenge of rebuilding their lives. Many had lost everything: family, friends, homes, and the very essence of their identities. The trauma of their experiences would stay with them for the rest of their lives. But the American soldiers' act of kindness on that hot July day would remain a symbol of the hope they so desperately needed. For the American forces, the task of caring for the survivors extended far beyond serving ice cream. Medical teams were immediately deployed to treat the sick and wounded, while supplies were brought in to address the starvation and deprivation that the prisoners had endured. But there was also the psychological toll to consider. The soldiers, many of whom had been hardened by the war, were now witnesses to the emotional devastation of those they had liberated. They were no longer just soldiers. They were caregivers, offering more than just food and shelter. They were offering the possibility of a future. Reports from the time reveal a complicated process of recovery for many of the survivors. Some, still in shock from their experiences, could not immediately understand or accept their freedom. For others, the process of healing was slow and painful, yet there was also a growing sense of optimism, sparked in part by small gestures like the ice cream. It was a moment that transcended the immediate circumstances, offering a glimpse of a better world that lay beyond the horrors of the camps. In the long term, the ice cream gesture became part of the larger narrative of how the American forces approached their mission of liberation. The stories of such small acts of kindness circulated widely, contributing to the image of the Americans as liberators, not only in a military sense but also in a humanitarian one. The images of soldiers handing out rations, medical supplies, and even comfort items like ice cream became part of the psychological landscape of post-war Europe. For many survivors, the act was a pivotal moment, an undeniable reminder that the world could still be a place of care and compassion, even after enduring the worst atrocities. For the soldiers, the aftermath of the liberation was emotionally complex. Many found themselves forever changed by the events they witnessed, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of the scale of human suffering. The ice cream was one small part of a much larger humanitarian mission, but its impact was lasting. It was, in a way, a defining moment in the soldiers' journey, not just as military men but as individuals who had seen the darkest aspects of humanity and yet had managed to offer something as simple, as human as ice cream. The smallness of the gesture made it all the more powerful. As the months passed, the physical scars of the survivors slowly healed, but the emotional wounds would never fully fade. Yet the kindness shown to them in their darkest hours left an indelible mark. Many of these women would go on to rebuild their lives, some even returning to their families, though many never fully recovered from the horrors they had experienced. The memory of the American soldiers, and particularly the moment of being served ice cream, would be carried with them as a symbol of the humanity they had fought so hard to retain. The simple act of serving ice cream on July 4, 1945, was far more than a moment of indulgence. It was a deeply symbolic gesture that transcended the boundaries of wartime brutality. In a world where everything had been stripped away, family, home, dignity, it was a reminder that the essence of humanity could still be found, even in the most unexpected of places. For the liberated women, the ice cream was an acknowledgement of their survival, their resilience, and their worth. It was a brief but powerful restoration of their humanity, something that had been denied to them for so long. For the American soldiers, it was a moment of realization that victory in war isn't just about military conquest. It's about restoring dignity to those who have suffered. The war was over, but its emotional toll would endure for both the liberators and the liberated. Yet, in that small moment of sharing ice cream, both sides were able to briefly reconnect with the warmth of human connection, a bond that war often seeks to erase. In the years that followed, this moment would live on as a symbol of the power of compassion in the face of overwhelming darkness. The ice cream wasn't just a comfort, it was a reminder that despite the horrors of the past, there was still sweetness to be found in the world. A small gesture, yet one that speaks volumes about the enduring strength of the human spirit in the most trying of circumstances. The air is thick with smoke and the relentless rumble of artillery. On the island of Iwo Jima, 1945, the battlefield is a furnace of destruction. American tanks, battered and scarred, churn through the muck, their engines roaring in the chaos of war. They are moving forward, inch by painful inch, as Japanese forces unleash a torrent of fire from hidden positions. The American tank crews, sitting in their metal beasts, face the intense heat of battle, yet they remain eerily calm. Inside their armored vehicles, the tension is palpable, but it is controlled. Every move is calculated. Every decision is deliberate. To the Japanese commanders observing from their entrenched positions, it seems almost unreal. How could these men remain so composed amid the hell of battle? By 1945, the Pacific theater of World War II had reached a crucial turning point. The United States had already secured several key victories, including the pivotal Battle of Midway in 1942, and the subsequent island-hopping campaigns that brought American forces closer to Japan's doorstep. One such campaign unfolded on the volcanic island of Iwo Jima, where American forces sought to capture a strategic base for launching air raids on the Japanese home islands. The battle would be one of the bloodiest in the Pacific, a desperate and costly struggle for both sides. The Japanese, entrenched in well-fortified positions, had adopted a defensive strategy that relied on deep bunkers and hidden artillery to repel the advancing Americans. For the Japanese, combat was about survival, holding the line at all costs. Their soldiers were trained to fight to the death, and their commanders placed enormous emphasis on psychological warfare, attempting to break the will of their opponents through overwhelming force and unrelenting pressure. In contrast, the American military, while far from immune to the horrors of war, was growing ever more adept at applying their resources with a combination of firepower and precision. One such resource was the M4 Sherman tank, a reliable yet often underappreciated workhorse of the American Armored Division. During the battle for Iwo Jima, these tanks were used in close support of infantry, helping to clear the entrenched positions that the Japanese held. But as American forces encountered the Japanese defense in the thick, smoky landscape of Iwo Jima, their calm under pressure was what truly set them apart. Japanese commanders, familiar with the high-strung, chaotic behavior often exhibited by those caught in the grips of battle, were stunned by the composure of the American tank crews. To them, it seemed impossible that men could endure such a storm of destruction without breaking, without losing control. Yet the American tank crews, through months of training and experience, displayed a remarkable steadiness in the face of danger, proving the unshakable resolve that had become emblematic of the American fighting spirit. The role of tanks in the Pacific was not as pronounced as in the European theater, where large-scale armored engagements were more common. However, the American tank forces on Iwo Jima played a critical, if underappreciated, role in the battle. The M4 Sherman, while not as heavily armored as some of its German counterparts, was versatile, reliable, and highly effective in providing support to infantry. On Iwo Jima, with its rugged terrain, volcanic ash, and entrenched Japanese positions, the Sherman was used to clear out pillboxes, suppress enemy artillery, and provide close fire support. The tanks were vital. In the brutal battle for Mount Suribachi and in the many deadly skirmishes that followed, despite the harsh environment and the limited maneuverability of tanks on the island's difficult terrain, these armored units proved remarkably effective. The psychological toll of such a battle on both sides was immense. For the American tank crews, the ever-present threat of hidden anti-tank guns, explosive traps, and constant Japanese fire created a high-stakes environment where nerves could fray quickly. However, what separated these crews from many others was the mental preparation instilled in them by their training. The American military had invested heavily in building resilience, focusing on mental toughness as well as physical readiness. Tank crews, specifically, were trained to keep their cool under fire, maintain strict discipline, and execute their orders with precision, traits that would become crucial in the Pacific campaigns. From the Japanese perspective, American tank crews were a source of confusion and frustration. The Japanese expected that tank crews, like most soldiers, would crack under the extreme pressure of close-quarters combat. But when the American tank crews remained calm, focused, and methodical, it defied the expectations of their adversaries. To the Japanese commanders, this resilience seemed almost unnatural, as if the American soldiers had somehow transcended the human limits of fear. As the battle raged on, the Japanese commanders grew increasingly frustrated with their inability to break the resolve of these tank crews, a frustration that only heightened the intensity of their defense. The mental and emotional resilience of American tank crews was tested to its limits on the battlefields of the Pacific. These soldiers, often young and inexperienced, faced the horrors of war from inside a metal box that offered both protection and isolation. The heat inside the tanks was unbearable, and the constant threat of sudden attack, whether from anti-tank guns, artillery, or infantry, was ever present. Yet these men maintained their composure in the most intense conditions. The psychological strain of combat was immense, but the crews had been trained to suppress fear and panic. Inside the cramped confines of the Sherman tanks, there was no room for hesitation. Tank commanders relied on their crews to execute rapid decisions under extreme pressure, knowing that any delay could be deadly. Yet, time and again, these men demonstrated extraordinary calm, even in the face of near-certain destruction. For many tankers, it was the constant rhythm of training and experience that allowed them to remain unfazed by the chaos around them. They learned to compartmentalize their fear, focusing on their mission rather than the horrors unfolding outside. For the Japanese, this composed demeanor was baffling. In their own culture, warriors were often trained to fight with intense emotional passion, drawing strength from anger, fear, or resolve. The American tank crew's ability to remain coldly focused in the face of such danger was a stark contrast, one that made them appear unnervingly inhuman. This level of psychological control, where soldiers could remain steady even under heavy fire, was something the Japanese had never fully encountered. The success of the American tank crews wasn't just a result of their mental fortitude, it was also tied to the tactics they employed. American tanks were designed for close support operations, meaning they worked hand in hand with infantry to break through entrenched Japanese positions. This combined arms approach allowed the tanks to suppress enemy fire and provide mobility for infantry units. The tank's calmness in battle was also a reflection of American tactics that encouraged controlled, methodical action. While the Japanese defense strategy was centered on ambush and overwhelming force, American tank crews were trained to act deliberately, maintaining communication with infantry units and responding to threats with measured precision. This strategic approach allowed them to maintain composure, even when surrounded by the chaos of battle. Unlike their Japanese counterparts who relied on surprise and overwhelming numbers to break the will of their enemies, American tank crews knew that patience and teamwork would ultimately tip the scales in their favor. The tanks themselves were also a testament to American tactical thinking. Despite their vulnerabilities, the M4 Shermans were equipped with powerful guns and thick armor for their role. More importantly, they were reliable, designed to be repaired quickly in the field and to keep moving under almost any conditions. While the Japanese had their own formidable weapons, including heavily fortified positions and potent anti-tank guns, the adaptability of the American tank crews, combined with their willingness to press forward despite the risks, gave them a significant tactical advantage. The M4 Sherman tank, though often outgunned and outclassed by some of its European counterparts, proved remarkably effective in the Pacific theater. Its design was pragmatic, favoring reliability and ease of repair over raw firepower. The tank's 75mm gun, while not the most powerful weapon in the arsenal, was effective enough for the challenges presented by the Japanese defenses. What truly set the Sherman apart, however, was its ability to function in the brutal conditions of the Pacific Islands. Its simple mechanics and high mobility were perfect for the muddy, volcanic terrain of islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The leadership of American tank commanders was also a crucial factor. Tank crews were trained not only in the technical operation of their machines, but also in leadership and mental resilience. Commanders, often the decision-makers in battle, had to rely on their crew members' composure and skill to execute their orders under extreme pressure. The dynamic between tank crew members, commander, driver, loader, and gunner, was built on trust and understanding. Each crew member knew their role inside and out, allowing them to act swiftly and decisively. In the chaotic and unpredictable combat environment of the Pacific Islands, this unity and coordination were invaluable. The ability of American tank crews to remain calm under fire was also a direct result of their leadership's foresight in training them for the psychological and emotional toll of combat. Military leaders understood that the battle for survival was as much mental as it was physical. Tank commanders instilled confidence in their crews, reassuring them that their training and preparation would see them through. This leadership, combined with the technological advantages of the M4 Sherman, provided the American forces with a powerful and unshakable presence on the battlefield, one that, despite the intensity of the fighting, remained controlled and focused. For the Japanese commanders, the sight of American tank crews remaining calm under extreme pressure was something they simply could not understand. The Japanese military had trained its soldiers in the art of emotional warfare, encouraging them to fight with fiery passion and an unwavering commitment to victory, even in the face of overwhelming odds. The expectation was that battle would evoke a strong emotional response, whether fear, anger, or adrenaline, that would push soldiers to fight harder. But the American tank crews, so calm and methodical, seemed to operate on a different level. To the Japanese, their ability to remain unfazed by intense combat was disorienting. This composure was in stark contrast to the more chaotic, reactionary approach of the Japanese forces, who often fought with frenzied energy in desperate attempts to break the American assault. The Japanese were accustomed to seeing their opponents crack under fire, but the steady, controlled behavior of the American tank crews was something entirely new. For the Japanese commanders, It became clear that the Americans were not only fighting with superior technology, but also with a kind of mental discipline that made their enemies difficult to break. As the battle raged on, Japanese morale began to erode and their frustration grew. The American tank crews, who had become the symbol of unwavering resolve, had disrupted their expectations and psychological strategies. The Japanese had underestimated the calm resilience of their opponents, and this miscalculation would ultimately play a significant role in the outcome of the battle. The battle for Iwo Jima reached a fever pitch in the early days of March 1945, as the American forces pressed on toward Mount Suribachi. Their progress was met with brutal resistance from the Japanese defenders, who were entrenched in a network of bunkers, caves, and pillboxes. Each foot of ground was contested fiercely, and every advance felt like an impossible struggle. Amid the chaos of mortar fire, artillery shells, and the deafening roar of machine guns, the American tank crews pushed forward with a single purpose: to break the Japanese stronghold. It was during this intense period of combat that the calmness of the American tank crews would be most evident. The tanks, their engines humming relentlessly, rolled forward through the smoke and dust of the battlefield. Japanese artillery fire crashed around them, but the tank crews continued their mission without hesitation, executing their orders with the precision of well-oiled machines. The air inside the tanks was stifling, the noise deafening, and the fear was ever present. But there was no panic. The crews communicated with quiet confidence, their actions fluid and controlled. The Japanese, watching from their hidden positions, could not comprehend how these men were able to endure such punishment without breaking. As the Americans advanced, the Japanese artillery intensified, but the tank crews simply adjusted, finding their targets, maintaining their focus. To the Japanese commanders, it felt like they were fighting against an indomitable force, one that refused to be rattled, no matter how overwhelming the attack. This unwavering composure turned the tide of the battle. The Japanese, frustrated and confused by the unshakable resolve of the American tankers, began to lose confidence in their ability to halt the American advance. The psychological advantage they had hoped to gain through intimidation and overwhelming firepower was slipping away. The more the Japanese tried to disrupt the American tanks, the more the calmness of the crews undermined their efforts. The American tanks, pressing relentlessly forward, began to crack the Japanese defenses one pillbox at a time. As the American tanks continued their methodical advance, the Japanese defense began to falter. The once unshakable belief that they could break the American forces through psychological pressure started to crumble. The calmness of the American tank crews had disrupted the Japanese commanders' strategy. In a battle where every moment was a struggle for survival, where adrenaline usually fueled the fighting spirit, the American crew's ability to stay focused and unflinching under heavy fire proved to be an unexpected advantage. The turning point came when a group of American tanks, having successfully neutralized one Japanese defensive position after another, began to push towards the final stretch of Mount Suribachi. With each wave of fire they withstood, the Japanese began to second-guess their tactics. The American tankers, unmoved by the intensity of their surroundings, maintained an almost eerie composure as they systematically wiped out entrenched positions. The Japanese, who had hoped to use surprise and emotional intensity to destabilize the Americans, now found themselves increasingly isolated and demoralized. The psychological advantage that they had hoped to gain had turned against them. The combination of the tank's reliable firepower and the unshakable resolve of the crews proved to be a deadly combination. It was during this final phase of the battle that the Japanese forces, realizing the futility of their defense, began to break down. With the advancing American tanks clearing the path for infantry to follow, the Japanese defenses were slowly but inevitably dismantled. What had once seemed like an impregnable stronghold was gradually collapsing under the relentless pressure of American firepower, compounded by the steady, unflappable presence of the tank crews. This psychological shift marked a decisive moment not only for the Battle of Iwo Jima, but also for the larger Pacific campaign. The calmness under fire that the American tank crews exhibited became a symbol of resilience, proof that even in the most brutal and chaotic of environments, maintaining focus and composure could ultimately lead to victory. By the time Mount Suribachi was secured, The Japanese commanders had come to the grim realization that their tactics, based on breaking the will of the enemy, had failed. The American tank crews, with their calm demeanor amidst the chaos, had rewritten the rules of warfare in the Pacific. By the time Iwo Jima was officially declared secure on March 16, 1945, the American forces had achieved a hard-fought victory at an immense cost. The battle had claimed the lives of nearly 7,000 American soldiers, with tens of thousands more wounded. The Japanese suffered even heavier losses, with more than 18,000 soldiers killed. But in the midst of this brutal conflict, the steadfastness of the American tank crews had been a defining factor in breaking the Japanese defense. The immediate aftermath of the battle saw the American forces consolidating their hold on the island, using it as a base to launch further air raids against the Japanese home islands. The psychological effect of the battle was profound for both sides. For the Americans, the battle for Iwo Jima had been a brutal test of endurance, and the calmness exhibited by the tank crews became part of the larger narrative of American resilience. It served as a reminder of the mental and emotional strength that the U.S. military had developed in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. On the Japanese side, the shock of seeing American tank crews remain unshaken by the intensity of combat caused a reevaluation of their tactics. The emotional warfare they had relied on to demoralize their enemies had failed in the face of the Americans' unflappable resolve. It would not be the last time the Japanese faced American forces with a similar psychological resilience, but the loss of Iwo Jima would serve as a major blow to their ability to mount further significant resistance in the Pacific. In the aftermath of the battle, both sides recognized the heavy toll that the war had taken, but the American tank crews' example would echo through future Pacific campaigns. Their calm under fire became a psychological weapon in itself, an example of the American military's discipline and focus, qualities that would continue to shape the U.S. approach to combat throughout the remainder of the war. The long-term consequences of the battle for Iwo Jima, particularly the role of the American tank crews, rippled through the Pacific campaigns that followed. The success of the tank units in maintaining their composure under fire demonstrated to the broader military that psychological resilience, as much as tactical or technological superiority, was key to victory. This became especially important in the subsequent battle for Okinawa, where similar tank tactics would be employed in even more intense and difficult conditions. The emotional discipline and calm exhibited by American tankers were now an ingrained part of the Pacific strategy, a model for future combat operations. For the Japanese, the defeat at Iwo Jima, compounded by the realization that their emotional tactics could not break the American spirit, marked the beginning of their larger collapse. As the war continued, Japanese commanders would struggle with mounting losses and the growing realization that their traditional methods of fighting, relying on passionate, emotional, and often suicidal combat, were becoming less and less effective against the methodical and resilient American approach. The battle for Iwo Jima and the performance of American tank crews had a lasting impact on Japanese morale, leading to further disillusionment as the war wound down. In the broader scope of World War II, Iwo Jima became a critical point in the Pacific campaign. The American military's ability to maintain such unshakable composure, exemplified by the tank crews, was a psychological victory as much as a military one. It was a reminder that in the chaos of war, the ability to remain calm under pressure can shift the course of history. Iwo Jima, with its high costs and fierce fighting, stood as a testament to the American military's mental toughness, a trait that would help carry them through the final push towards Japan's surrender in August 1945. The battle for Iwo Jima, marked by brutal intensity and unrelenting fire, stands as a striking testament to the power of mental fortitude in warfare. The American tank crews, who faced the chaos of battle with extraordinary calm, showed that victory was not only a product of technological superiority or military might. Their unwavering composure under fire became an indelible part of the American fighting spirit, a reminder that in the most harrowing of circumstances, psychological strength could be as potent a weapon as any tank or rifle. For the Japanese commanders, the realization that their traditional methods of warfare, based on emotional intensity and attempts to break the enemy's will, had failed was a turning point. They had underestimated the ability of the American forces to remain cool and collected under the harshest of conditions. This miscalculation, in part, led to their downfall in the Pacific, as they found themselves unable to adapt to the resilience of their adversaries. The legacy of those tank crews, who faced death and destruction yet never lost their nerve, went beyond the battlefield of Iwo Jima. It reshaped how soldiers and commanders alike would approach warfare in the future. The ability to endure, to stay focused in the midst of madness, became an essential lesson of the Pacific Campaign and a symbol of American resolve. In the end, it was not only the tanks that broke the Japanese defenses, it was the unshakable calm of the men who operated them, and their belief that despite the horrors surrounding them, they would not falter.